Hello, this is Arne Koets from the Kemenate in Lauchöden, and today I have a guest, Jeff Sanders here, and my good friend and obviously a very well-known horse trainer and rider in his own right. Now, today we had decided that we really needed to talk about bits to you, and bits is an absolutely massive topic. There's so many different types of bridles, and then of course within bridles there's so many types of bits. And the thing that we really want to talk about is a very standard type of thinking about snaffles versus curbs in particular. Of course, then there's a whole bunch of other things we could talk about, but we'll be here for weeks. So we'll just start with that main idea. And one of these main ideas is that you would have either single jointed snaffles or double jointed snaffles of various types, and those are considered as mild. And then you would have something like a curb bit, which would be considered sharp. And that you would transition from one to the other, and that there is more carefulness to be had with the curb than with the snaffle. This is a fairly standard sort of thinking. A lot of people have been told this many, many times. And we kind of disagree with that premise in many different ways. So the mechanics in which these bits work is actually quite different. Thereby comparing them just in one metric of sharpness is a bit weird, because they are so different to one another that it's comparing apples to pears. And these effects are not necessarily more or less severe. Well, in a way, it's fairly simple. It is easier to get to a discomfort or even pain response with a snaffle than it is with a curb.
And to
That's a big statement.
To do it accidentally too.
Yeah, exactly. So
it.
how much leeway do I have to apply the bit in the way that I meant to, rather than applying it in a way that I did, but I didn't really mean for that to happen? Or for the horse to push on my hand, and what will happen? And the horse will still feel a discomfort, even if I did not mean to. Those things are quite different from one to the other. So in basis, we say that a snaffle is more direct, thereby can act more quickly and more unintentionally quickly, whereas a curb has more leeway, and thereby we have more opportunity to stay within the lower regimes of effect, very low regimes of effect, rather than the higher, more severe regimes of effect. But this is taking some caveats. And this has to do with the concept of contact, what we even mean by that. So specifically for this talk, we're assuming residual pressure on the rein to mean contact, or Anlehnung. And if you have that on snaffles or on curbs, the whole landscape of bits changes quite dramatically. The effects might turn around 180 degrees of what is going to go on, what you expect the bit to do. And the amount of severity will very quickly change a lot, and usually for the worse. So are you using a bit as a signal influence, where you have an influence that is very, very brief? Or are you using it as a continual pressure, and then maybe add a little bit more, a little bit less as the signal? These are two major general ideas of how to use bridles. Now, of course, there's many in-between amounts that this person does that and that person does that, but there's this huge dichotomy and so many different ways of using bridles. But these are the main ideas, especially here in sort of European riding thinking about snaffles and curbs. So we want to go into a bit more detail why we say that the curb has more leeway. I mean, that's a pretty big thing to say.
Yeah.
Why we say that the snaffle is more direct and more immediate and potentially more severe. That's a big statement to make, so we want to go into a bit of detail. So let's go over all of that in detail.
Yes. So Jeff. First thing, just to lay a little more groundwork, just a short piece. We have to make sure that we understand that we are either working on signal, as Arne said, or we might be working on a pain compliance response. Do you know the difference in what you're doing with your horse? So when we look at these different bits, number one is mechanically, can the horse protect its mouth from having metal on bone? And what I mean by that is, when we'll take this horse's little tongue out here. When we look at this skull, can we keep the bit from putting pressure on the bars here? So as we look at this, some of the horses, this can be quite sharp. And are we able to prevent getting metal on that bone. Remember, this is just covered by very thin skin and there's nerves and all kinds of stuff. The tongue, remember, is designed to move food into that horse's mouth. It is much easier for that horse to protect itself and not have a pain response if the pressure is on the tongue versus if the pressure is on the bars. When we look at these different tools, what happens mechanically in the mouth? So should we go over that first, some of the mechanics?
Yeah.
Okay. So with the snaffle bit, whether it's the three-piece or the two-piece, single or double jointed snaffle, one of the things we have to keep in mind is that the bit will generally work in some form of this kind of action, okay? So that bit is going to move right, left this way. It's going to move in that horse's mouth. But what we have to keep in mind is something most people or a lot of people don't realize. The horse's tongue is not round where the bit sits. Very few are. Every once in a while you'll have an outlier. But the vast majority of the horses, their tongue is actually concave. It's like this. Okay? Some of them are so concave it's like a taco. So now you have a bit that is working in this kind of action here with a tongue that is shaped in completely the other way. So to give you an idea on the tongue, it is kind of like your hand. The bottom part is dexterous. It's used to move the food back into the back of the mouth. The upper part is rounded to move the food right and left for grinding. The bit sits on that bottom part that is a bit concave. So now we put that snaffle bit on that concave tongue, and now we completely change the shape of the tongue, which then is going to, of course, create some amount of tension in the mouth. And what happens then, that relates to how that tension affects everything. The jaw, the TMJ, the hyoid, the muscle structure that connects into the chest, the muscle structure that connects into the shoulders, the pole, all of it is interconnected with what's happening with the tongue. In fact, so much so that some years ago we did a dissection in New Zealand, and we had the horse. It was obviously a dissection, so dead horse on a table, and we had a snaffle bit in the mouth, and I picked up the rein and I was moving it right and left in the horse's mouth, and we had somebody holding the hind leg right above the hoof at the pastern joint, and she could feel a pulsing in the hind leg from what I was doing in the mouth on a dead horse. That's how interconnected the mouth is through the entire body. So when we look at what's happening, people think, well, okay, it's no big deal. I just pick up on the rein, I make the horse work. Yeah, you are, but are you actually communicating in the most effective way possible? This is the most primitive tool we have for riding a horse, historically. Just right, left, whoa. But when we're looking at the actual communication, like Arne said earlier, it is a direct pressure. As soon as you pick up that rein, you are going to have pressure in the mouth. Whether that pressure is coming up, going down, coming right and left, no matter where it's going, you are going to have that pressure immediately. When we look at the curb bits, a lot of times we're going to have a lot of signaling happening before we actually get any pressure from the mouthpiece itself. The other is that when we look at this, we have to remember that horses learn from the release of pressure better than they do just from pressure, and they also thrive on consistency. So one of the things with these bits, we have to remember any bit that has moving parts, the more moving parts we have on that bit, the more the horse can actually change the shape of the tongue of what that bit is doing with its tongue. And when it changes the shape of that bit, you lose the consistency of your signal. It might be here, it might be here, it might be over here. You actually need much better hands to ride effectively in a snaffle bit than you do oftentimes in a curb bit.
This is a really important point, and we're not saying that the implement is inherently always evil.
No.
We're saying there's different levels of precision, control, and skill needed for different implements. That's a different statement. So one of the things that we see here, this placement in the mouth. Now, of course, there was this one particular study where they x-rayed the bits in the horse's mouth, and you see that the horses will lay them quite drastically to one side. and quite often consistently the whole time. And the moment they get a chance, I put it immediately back. So this is extremely common. Now, maybe I'm exaggerating a little bit, but it's about that far. So this also means that any influence with my left rein is now a different implement than the right rein. And of course, we could try this with the other one. You can quite often see this, where the joint is essentially on the side of the tongue. This is what the horse wants to force this implement into. And then, of course, there's turning effects, there's pulling effect, there's some rocking effects and things like that. If this lies here, we have this effect, and you can see the cloth here. As I pull back, you can see the cloth go sideways. And people say there's no nutcracker effect in a snaffle. Well, you can see, well, there is. Now, how severe that effect is a completely different discussion.
Determined by the placement of the head, but it's there.
Yeah, it's there.
Yeah.
Now, one of the other things is if you look at the side here, you see the hole there. What is going on the side of the bars under the lips? What is going on the side of the tongue? So when I'm starting to have angles like that, or as the horse is more on the bridle, I can pull back more, or I could pull a little bit more up, or I can rotate it a little bit. And this will have different effects on the tongue or on the bars, or if the horse pulls its tongue a bit more up, what's going to happen to the bridle. Now this could happen with any bridle, and that needs to be considered in both those permutations.
There is a difference, though. Can you hand me that one on the far right? Just because that'll be easier to look at. So when we look at this, we have a consistency that we don't have with any bit that has any kind of joints. So when you pick up on the left rein, you're going to get the same thing every time. The horse can also very easily use the tongue to keep the metal off of the bone. It can protect its mouth. The other thing that's super important that a lot of people don't think about is how much you can feel as a rider. So when we look at this, if you think about this as from a rider's perspective, if I pick this up, first of all, I have a lot of action here before the mouthpiece ever moves. We have the curb strap moving, all of that. But then it's very easy for me to feel what's happening and be able to feel the tongue through my reins. When we have a bit that's jointed, it's oftentimes very hard to feel how much tongue pressure we have, or if we even have pressure on the bars. And that's something that's super important is, can you feel when your bit, regardless of style of bit, moves from tongue pressure to bar pressure? Because the moment it goes to bar pressure, whether you like it or not, you are working on a pain compliance response.
So, and this feeds into feel. There's, of course, this whole plethora of things that are happening in the horse's mouth are happening in a landscape of the movements in the horse and all the effects in the entire horse. So when you're feeling under your seat, you're feeling the movement of the horse. One of the things we were talking about is the muscles of the neck and the interaction between the beds. It goes back and forth. It's a two-way street. So for instance, if the horse is too much on the forehand and it's putting its front leg under and it's trying to pull its hoof out of the sand, it might very well use the brachiocephalicus, its underneck. This affects how the tongue works. This affects how the horse is going to interact with your hand. So you could notice this in your hand. You could notice this in your seat, and thereby actually know it earlier before it really reaches the mouth of the horse. So there's this whole thing of how much awareness do you have as you're trying to manage your bridle. And of course, the more awareness you have, the more you can stay within a smaller regime of leeway. And the less awareness you have, the more leeway you will have to build into the system to not use a bridle in a way that you never intended, which could be a pain response, a discomfort response, maybe if we're lucky. But we want it to be much more constructive than that. And I think it's important to state it can be much more constructive than that if you know what you're doing and if you choose the right bit and make it fit. One of these things is it is hard in many mouths to fit a snaffle in there.
Just real quick on that. It's not only really hard, it's the percentage of horses that mechanically cannot go in a snaffle is much higher than most people realize. And we see this all over the internet. It's all about the hands, it's all about the rider's hands, it's all about the rider's hands. To a point. There is a mechanical interaction with the horse, and some years ago I did a study, over 200 horses. We had 80%, 86% of the horses that we studied, we had at least one veterinarian present. And what we found is that over 27% of the horses mechanically could not go in either a double or single jointed or double jointed snaffle, just based on mechanics, no matter how good the rider's hands were. And this was horses all over the world, no specific breeds, over 200 horses that we studied, specifically studying the single and double jointed snaffle. However, that means that about 2/3 can, but it has to be fitted correctly and your hands have to be phenomenally good.
So, and of course, there's many different types. We have a few that we happen to have here on the table, of course, there's leeway to solve all sorts of problems.
Yeah.
But if the problems are inherently easy to run into, there's a lot more fitting that needs to happen to avoid running into the problem.
Yes.
So that it's a huge statement to make. We know that. To really qualify what Jeff just said there, we're going to be here for another week. So we need to kind of jump over that. We might elaborate on that in a future date. Now, when it comes to curb action, there's a few things we need to mention, and we use this bit, and of course this is not the most standard curb because it has the cricket and this whole thing.
All kinds of stuff.
And of course we're much more talking about something in this order, where we left the reins on this one. You see that there's a very limited port. And this is kind of important. The size of a port in a curb will make a difference. Let's start off with assuming one of these. Well, we'll use that one because it's out of the bridle. So as it's in the mouth of the horse, it can rotate, and it can rotate around where it's supported by the horse the mouth of the horse, in this case the tongue. And as it rotates, as you apply the reins, there is not a lever action yet. The word yet is important there. So when, as you watch this from the side, as this goes forward, the top, the banquette here, goes forward until it can do no more. So when a curb chain or a curb strap stops this motion forward, that is when the rotational point becomes here, and that's when we're pushing the mouthpiece into the horse's mouth with lever action. That is when we have an amplification of the force by means of lever. Only then.
Yes. And a lot of stuff happens before that.
Yeah, and there's the interesting stuff is all before that, especially if you want to do more sophisticated riding, is that there's lots of effects and signals that we want to use that are before the lever actually acts. Important thing is people talk about the length of shank. Very, very basic physics. The ratio of these implements relative to one another define how much the force is amplified. Not the absolute length.
Yeah.
Yet, the absolute length does matter because there is an angle where I set this curb chain or curb strap to stop this motion, thereby to start the lever, like we said. And that the longer the implement is, the further the travel is at the bottom before I reach this point. So a low ratio bit will put less force amplification in, is thereby less severe. But a long bit, absolutely long, will make it a bigger difference in what I do with my reins before I go from one effect to another as I escalate through the effects the bridle can make. So longer is better.
And really quickly on that point, all of this is presupposing that you have a bit that you can actually feel the tongue through your hands. Because if your hands aren't educated enough to feel the tongue, that's when you create the pain in any bit. It doesn't matter which one. That's where you end up with a pain compliance response because you can't feel the moment you've gone from tongue pressure to bone.
And this has to do with compliance of the horse. So the horse will react with a specific effect. There's many as we've seen, and we've not talked about all of them yet. And there will be a point at which that particular effect I'm looking for, as I'm picking up the rein, the compliance will be there. Or the horse will start reacting. It might even be unconscious reaction, a biomechanical reaction, a subtle reaction. If I then keep the pressure on, this point of reaction will start shifting rather quickly to become a further and further point. The horse usually starts at a very low point to react to pressure. Touch, I suppose, of the bridle. And then it is being able to get up to the point where you have your effect you wanted and then be able to release again. And that makes it a signal. If you keep that pressure on, you're moving the bar of where the horse will comply or react in any way. And this means that the amount of force I need to get the horse to do what I want will change as a result. And it might change for the better or it might change for the worse, depending on how good a rider I am. Now, the thing is that people are pretty good at finding that line initially. Like if you get in someone else's car, the accelerator won't be the same as your own, yet within seconds we are managing that. That is a human thing. However, we keep that accelerator at whatever miles an hour we're driving. We're very good at keeping that on as well. And this is not useful in riding. So, back to the effects of this of the curb bit. So, as we were talking about, you pick it up and as it rotates around, there's an initial effect where the horse just feels the whole thing move. There's not really anything else happening, but it can feel that little movement in there. And it could already comply to simply that, because it has understood the signal. Then there's a point where the curb chain starts actually interacting with the actual chin of the horse. So it starts touching it, it barely touches it. Or maybe just rubs the cheek just gently like that, and the horse can comply to that in and of itself. Then that can rub up until it can go no further. And as the curb chain rubs up the chin of the horse, that is when we start having the point where that curb chain can go no further, and then we apply the actual lever action, pushing the bit down into the horse's tongue or potentially bars if the horse has pulled its tongue up.
And with the Snaffle, you get none of that.
There's no escalation, it is there straight away. The effect that you happen to have with that particular bridle is immediate. So this escalation allows you to be more precise, yet more kind, frankly. Now, because it's not so immediate, this is a benefit if you're not looking at a discomfort or pain response to ride with. If you are reliant on back pressure of the horse to move it, using the resistance of the horse to, for instance, create cadence in your horse. If you need that back pressure on the bridle and on the jaw for the horse to create that cadence in the first place, then you will find that this pickup will be in your way.
Yeah.
And because you need to get beyond that pickup to start using that kind of an effect. So there's different effects in the horse. You can also get cadence from your seat and getting the horse to lift its shoulders. This is different cadence. I would say better cadence.
I would agree.
Fundamentally. But that also means you're actually actively trying to avoid continual pressure on the tongue or bars, side or top, different. And in order for the horse to carry itself better, to use its shoulder sling better.
Also, side note, pull pressure from the bridle is negligible. That really only comes into play when you have the curb strap way too loose and you get too much rotation of this upper branch. And when you get excessive rotation of that upper branch here, that's when you start getting pull pressure on the bridle. If your curb strap or curb chain is properly adjusted, it's negligible. A lot of people talk about it. You can test it yourself, super easy. Just put your fingers up there, have somebody pick up the reins, or you pick up the reins with your fingers up there. It'll tell you right away. So just, you put your fingers under there, you pick up your bit, you'll be able to feel how much pull pressure there is. So you can take that out of the realm of theory and Facebook discussions and actually just figure it out for yourself without a problem.
There is some opportunity for the bridle to push forward onto the horse's ears, and they can be a bit sensitive about that. But usually it is because the curb chain is too long, and then this whole thing moves further. Now, this is basic trigonometry in that as the curb bit will rotate further, the amount of travel that way along the cheek piece will become more significant once we get closer to 90 degrees. Now, we shouldn't ever get there.
No.
But even when you do, for the sake of argument, if you undo the curb chain, there is some pull pressure at the end of that, but it's actually remarkably little because as the other thing, if you could hold the thing, I'll put it on here and I'll shoot and do this. So we'll put it there.
Yep.
I've got so prepared for this. So curb chain. So as this is here, and I'm trying to pick this up, the other thing is that the actual bit can move up and down a little as well. So of course, as the curb chain then touches the the bars, it will stop this from traveling too far, because it can be further down in the horse's mouth or further up. Now this is a pony skull, this is a very small horse's mouth, but quite often if you have it a little bit further down, there's actually quite a bit of leeway before you're getting in the realm of teeth and what not. So there's also a little bit of lifting the bit up rather than pushing this down any amount. So pull pressure is extremely small. It is a signal a horse could react to. A very small signal can be reacted to by a horse, but it's not necessarily severe. It's not as if you're going to pinch nerves, which are also further down in the horse's neck, so they're not going to have a great deal of effect. Yeah. So this effect here is where you have this little travel. So if we show this from the side, so you have this little travel, and before the curb chain really pulls down on there, there's this little rotation, and then you have a little creeping effect through here. And then once that creeping effect is over, that's when it starts pushing. And you see that we call this tongue freedom in German, the port, will reduce a little bit of pressure on there as you do this, especially on this small skull. However, of course, the risk that everybody always talks about is ports pushing in the roof of the mouth. When you have higher ports, that becomes an issue. With these low ones, it's actually relatively hard to get to that point.
Yeah, it's not going to usually be a problem.
And so it does depend on the design of the mouthpiece, but this is sort of the common thing that we see today. So the curb bits. Curb bits have ways of using them that we
could spend all day talking about.
Yeah, they have a series of opportunities to use influences to help the horse understand what you want. It is an ability to use also a rotational effect rather than pulling. The reins are flexible. I can pull the horse's head towards me, which is what I'm usually very quickly reduced to with snaffles, which is why the discussion of the height of the hand becomes very, very important once you start riding with a snaffle. Whereas with a curb, the actual rotation in the bit, which also creates that lever, but also that rotation in and of itself gives direction to what you can do, including direction of the give. And as Jeff was mentioning, it's the give that really makes the horse understand what you're wanting it to do. And if I give direction to the give as well as the take, I can make more understanding and I can have more direct biomechanical effects to be constructive as a result. This allows me to reduce the amount of pressure I put on the horse in general to get to the point where we have a reaction, we have an understanding, we have a learning opportunity for the horse, and we get to a constructive progression where the horse becomes more and more easy to ride and easy to be ridden for itself.
So just kind of to wrap something up here, he mentioned earlier more sophisticated riding. And this is where I just ran into it this last weekend. Had a couple people at the clinic, and their horses were educated past where the snaffle bit was effective. So if you're looking at more sophisticated riding, I kind of compare this to telephones. So we have the old, some of us are old enough to remember when the phone was on the wall. Remember? Yeah. Yeah, you can call and have a conversation, a primitive conversation, compared to a modern smartphone where you have email, Facebook, WhatsApp, all that. You have a lot of ways to communicate because there's a lot of signaling going on, or you have a phone on the wall. It's your choice. So when we're talking about sophisticated riding, this is a very primitive tool. Yes, it can be effective, but if you want to up your riding, you might want to think about upping elevating the tools that you're using to hopefully match the level of education of you and your horse.
So, and one of the things you see is that it's easier to whisper with a curb if you know how to whisper. Yeah. And it is easier to keep whispering when also the excrement hits the ventilator. Yeah. Because it's not always going to go according to plan. A horse might shy, something might happen. Am I still going to use my bridle as I had planned? And this is actually easier with the curb. Yeah. And this is why the old masters say never give a snaffle to a beginner, always give them a curb, because the snaffle is for the educated rider to correct a horse with. I didn't make that up, that's in the sources. So you actually have more leeway in the form of that take. You have more leeway before you apply all the potential effects of the bridle.
And that the tradition I was raised in as kids, we weren't given snaffle bits as kids to ride in. We were given bridles.
Now, we didn't touch on bow styles and sorts of things like that.
that's all
There's
different.
many more things to talk about
Yep.
because bow styles are very sophisticated tools that, however, give you leeway.
Yeah.
And there's lots of different options, bitless options, and so forth that all need to kind of belong in this discussion. But we just wanted to have the dichotomy between snaffles and curbs. We are not saying that anybody you see with a snaffle is an evil person.
No.
We are not saying that because you can do great work with snaffles if you know what you're doing, if you understand the intricacies and understand what you might do and might not do.
But you have to be very educated for that.
I'm fond of saying if I'm going to the hospital and my surgeon is going to operate on me, I would hope them to have a very, very sharp scalpel. However, I'm not going to give that sharp scalpel to a chimpanzee. And the thing is that I compare snaffles to these surgeon scalpels. If you know what you're doing, the sharper scalpel will make less pain in the patient. If you know what you're doing, but you need to respect that every bit needs management. There's a manual of arms, you would say, in the gun community. And comparing them to weapons is close to my heart because I like to use swords on my friends as a hobby where we hit each other with blunt swords and we all have fun with that. But only because I control that I don't actually hurt my friends and my friends trust me that I'm not going to apply the weapon to them in a way that is going to hurt them, or at least they trust that I'm going to try. Now the thing with bits is, again, this is in a sense like a weapon. I can, with all of these, hurt my horse if I wanted to try and do that. I can. I'm just going to choose not to do that. And my horse should trust me to choose not to do that. But I need to be aware that it is a weapon that could be negligently discharged.
Or accidentally create pain we didn't intend to.
Exactly.
Yes.
And we are responsible for making that not happen. And that is what is the best choice for that horse, for its tendencies, for its conformation, for our position in the saddle, for our purposes that we want to do. And there the curb is not automatically evil and the snaffle is not automatically kind. That's the main statement. It's not automatically nice, evil. No, it's more complicated than that. And if you were to deduce it to that much, then a snaffle might more easily become evil than you think. Especially blue tongues, where the blood vessels in the tongue on the sides, which is where you can have pressure from a snaffle pushing on the sides of the tongue, thereby, especially with pressure staying for a longer period, over several minutes, then you reduce blood flow in the tongue much more readily with a snaffle than you do with a curb. So even if you miss using a curb completely the wrong way with too much constant pressure, it's less likely to create a blue tongue than too much constant pressure on a snaffle. So if you combine the two, double trouble. But the point being that it's the constant pressure that makes a blue tongue, not so much the choice of implement. And if you're going to look at the double bridle, then the snaffle is usually the culprit of that.
Yeah.
So don't just assume, oh, I'm only pulling on the snaffle, so thereby I'm fine. No, pulling is bad.
Yeah. Yeah, and that's kind of the bottom line, is that we're not pulling on any of them. Yeah. We're using them to signal the horse. If you're riding by pulling, yeah, you're going to have problems with any of them. If you're just pulling on the reins and dragging the horse around by their nose, any of these are going to be a problem. So just don't do that.
Yes, that's generally a bad idea.
Yeah.
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 Yeah, and there's ways of doing that consistently,
Yeah.
correctly, which is great. Anyway, before we keep ranting on, thank you very much for your attention, and hopefully this gives you some idea. There's much more to say, to argue this case more
This is
thoroughly.
barely scratching the surface.
And this is problematic to keep it this short, but thank you very much.